So the exhortation today will be provided by our brother Dyron Hamlin, and his topic is the heroism of persistence, and he does not have an opening reading. So we'll turn it over to brother Dyron.
Good morning. Can everybody hear me okay? And is this on? All good? All right. Hit the button. I may even borrow this Bible. All right. Well, for those of you that don't know me, I'm Cheryl's son. Since she's the one here, I'm Shannon's brother, Ty's brother-in-law. Dyron. I'm from Little Rock right now, Little Rock, Arkansas. So I think I've picked up a little bit of an accent out there, but I want to talk about the heroism of persistence. So, a brief history. You ever look in the Bible at a book, especially for younger people, one of the books of the Bible that you don't know very much about, and you wonder to yourself, I wonder why this is in here? Has anybody had that experience? Right? So I'm going to talk to you about two of those today. One is Ecclesiastes, and the other one is Hosea. Okay? Anybody feel strongly about either one of those books? If you feel strongly about Ecclesiastes, I'll take issue with you, because I've been studying Ecclesiastes intensively for about 20 years because I'm fascinated by it. Ecclesiastes really means the preacher. You see the word ecclesia in there, right? So it means preacher, and I think Ecclesiastes actually makes a wonderful preaching tool. And I don't think it's named the preacher by accident. And I think in our day and age, it is especially relevant. And so I'm going to tell you I'm going to give you one little tidbit I've learned from Ecclesiastes. I'm going to give you one little tidbit I've learned from Hosea, lest you think I'm going to go on and on and on and on. All right. So a brief history. I am 41 years old. I used to be younger. Somebody pointed out to me the other day, we did some training in our office about 7 years ago in Little Rock, and we were looking at some old videos of that training session. They said, man, you looked a lot younger then. And I said, well, the Bible says man gets 70 years, and if by reason of strength he gets 80, the last 10 are toil and sorrow. Is everybody aware of that? That's what it says. It says that in Psalm 90. I said, so if I'm only going to live 70 years, and that's 7 years ago, that's 10% of my life, I should look older. Like, this is normal. And we're in a weird society now that values the young, right? We think it's all about preserving youth. And that's not what we're being taught here. It's not about preserving yourself at all, is it? Okay, so in celebration of my 40th last year, this is a little bit for Joseph, because he said he was going to join me, but he didn't join me. Because it was a beating. I decided to give myself a beating. So I rode my bicycle from Arkansas to Virginia. It was sort of a spiritual reverse trip of my life, because I moved from Virginia to Arkansas in 1994, and I've been there most of the time since. And I said, I'm going to take this. I think about Moses, right? His life was divided up into 3 40-year periods. He was 40 years in Egypt, then he was 40 years off in Midian, and then he's 40 years rolling with the Israelites out of Egypt. So this was my first 40. I know I'm hoping I get a second 40. And I don't know if I really want a third 40. That would be a lot of years, but we'll see what happens. Okay, so for my first 40th, I rode my bicycle from Little Rock to Richmond. It took me 9 days. It was 1,100 miles. And it was, there were some ups and downs. So I quit 3 times. I quit 3 times, but each time I quit, I would text Maria, my wife, and I would say, I quit. And then she would text me back and say, Asher says don't quit. Now, my son, Asher, is 18 years old. And then you got to think, well, if I quit, what is my son going to think of me? He's in the prime of his physical life, right? And so I knew I couldn't quit. So I would keep going. So I want to talk to you a little bit about persistence and one of the things I learned. This is the one thing I learned about Ecclesiastes. I've been studying Ecclesiastes for 20 years pretty intensively. If you really want to know in depth what I think about it, I did a series of classes at Manuka Bible School in 2013. And they're available online. And that's actually one of the things I did on my bicycle trip. I listened to probably no less than 30 hours of material on the book of Ecclesiastes. I want you to put yourself in this. Okay, it sounds really exciting and fascinating, but most of the time when you're riding your bicycle, especially if I was riding anywhere from 10 to 12 hours a day, it's just a lot of this, right? There's a lot of just straight out persistence. And it's not very exciting, to be honest with you. It's really quite dull, a lot of it. Like life, right? A lot of life is fairly dull. Okay, so as I'm thinking about how dull this is, I'm listening to the book of Ecclesiastes over and over in these classes about Ecclesiastes that talk about how life is meaningless and it's pointless and it's nothing but basically spinning your wheels. So do you see there's just this beautiful irony. So I get to the middle, almost the dead center of my ride. And I'm in Scottsboro, Alabama, and I'm staying at a Hampton Inn. I burned all my hotel points to do all this trip. And I'm staying at this Hampton Inn, and I sat up, bolt upright in bed at 2 in the morning with what I can only describe as an epiphany. So turn your Bibles to Ecclesiastes 12, and I want to share this first little point with you. Ecclesiastes chapter 12, and verse 12 says, "Further, by these, my son, be admonished. Of making many books there is no end, and much study is a weariness of the flesh." Now, I'd already quit twice by this point, and I was thinking as I had been listening to all my Ecclesiastes classes, this is what I'm doing today. I am wearing out my flesh. And I'd always thought of this verse as a very kind of depressing verse, right? And a lot of people think of Ecclesiastes as a very depressing book, but it's not at all. Actually, what Ecclesiastes is doing is it's giving you a very realistic view of life on this earth. And it liberates you from these myths that the world wants to throw at you, that we have to preserve our youth and that I need to somehow be able to still beat my son in a foot race. That's ridiculous. I can't beat him anymore. I might beat him. I'm training. I'm still training. So I've always thought of this particular verse as being a very negative verse. Like, why write books? Why study? It wears you out. There's no end to it. But that's if you're thinking that weariness of the flesh is something bad, and it's not. What does the Bible tell us? What's the theme here? The theme here is that what we're doing, we're here and we're interacting with each other, but we are looking for something better, right? And on this planet, your job is to wear out your flesh. That's what you're here for. So I like to say in racing, you leave it all on the course. You got to wear out your flesh. That is the purpose. And you persist. And you go through the slow times and the bad times and the hard times. And at the end of it, lo and behold, you're worn out. You've worn out your flesh. And there's a certain heroism to that. And you look at people that are at the end of their life and they've maintained their faith. And they've remained solid in their commitments, right? You think about people that hold true to their word and are solid with their commitments in the long term. There is something inherently beautiful about that, isn't there? And it's actually way better, and this is why Solomon says, there's other verses throughout Ecclesiastes you look at and you go, what? He says that the day of death is better than the day of your birth. How could that possibly be? Well, the reason is you're looking back and you go, there it is. I left it all on the course. I left nothing undone. I wore out my flesh. That's what we're working on. Every day you get up, you say, I'm going to wear out my flesh. All right. So again, I sit up, bolt upright in bed, and I'm like, and I had struggled to understand this verse forever. But that's the point. So now, over the last year, I've been thinking about these other two things and just sort of pondering. what does he say? Making many books and much study. That's what wears your flesh out. All right, so what does that mean? I mean, not everybody in this room is going to write a book. But what are you doing? What is a book? A book is something that you want to communicate to other people, right? You're trying to capture your understanding or your view of things, and you're trying to lay it out there for other people to see. I would submit that writing books is basically the same thing as teaching. It's teaching in the long term. So somebody's going to pick up your book that you wrote 20, 40, 80 years from now, and is going to look at what you said, and they're going to learn something from it. So it's teaching and it's learning. Much study, that's learning. So every day you wake up, you say, I'm going to teach some people some things, and I'm going to learn some things. This is the way that you are going to wear out your flesh on this earth. Every day, think about people you encounter. You've got something that you could teach them, and you probably have something that you could learn from them. Okay, so this is the way that I'm seeing maybe my second 40, if I get that many. All right, let's flip over to Hosea. So, teaching and learning and teaching and learning and teaching and learning. This is what we're here for. All right, the book of Hosea. I've been reading this book, speaking of learning. I've been reading this book about the prophets by a guy named Abraham Heschel. Has anybody ever read that? Heschel, the prophets. It is going to take a lot of persistence to get through this book. So I've gotten to Hosea, which is only about 3 prophets in. And there's a lot of material in there. And the guy's an amazing writer. It was written in the 1960s, but he's opening up really more than just what the prophets were teaching, but who they were. Okay, so Hosea was a baker and he was a farmer. Hosea's book is focused on the knowledge of God. So if you want to think about the learning process, this is what this is for. So this idea of the knowledge of God, it comes up about 15 times in the book of Hosea, to know God. And I want to tell you about, there's a Hebrew word which is yada. And I know you're thinking you automatically go to yada, 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 right? People say that, yada, yada, yada. Well, yada is the word in Hebrew, is the word for to know. That's what we read in Genesis when Adam knew his wife and she conceived and bore him a son and called his name Abel. That word to know, which we all know what that means to know in that context, right? Adam knew his wife, and there's a very intimate implication to this word. Now, I want you to think about that in context of knowing God, the knowledge of God. And this is one of the things that God demonstrates through this very bizarre story in the book of Hosea. Hosea is principally concerned with the inner attachment to God by his people. In a sense, to have sympathy for God's view of his bride, adulterous though she may be. Let's look over at, actually, we'll come back to Hosea, but look over at Exodus chapter 2, verses 24 and 25. This is how God feels about the nation of Israel. This is how he feels about us today. Exodus 2, verses 24 and 25. He says, and God heard their groaning. This is as they were in the bondage of Egypt. He heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And God looked upon the children of Israel, and God had respect unto them. And that is an unfortunate translation. Not only did he have respect unto them, he knew them. He knew them, he yada'd them. He knew them in the same way that Adam knew his wife, and she conceived and bare him a son named Abel. And I know hopefully that makes you just kind of go, ooh. You know, that's a heavy, intimate relationship between a husband and a wife, isn't it? And that's another thing that's been ruined a little bit by our modern society. It's not that new. It's not that new, but an appreciation for what marriage is, as opposed to the idea that, oh, Adam knew his wife and she conceived, like it was just this singular, simple event. That's not what marriage is it? That's intercourse. This is a marriage of a different variety. He had respect unto them, does not do justice to what God felt when he saw these Israelites in bondage in the land of Egypt. It says he knew them. What does that mean? He's wanting to establish this intense inner attachment with his people. Okay, and in the domain, I'm going to read a little bit from Heschel, and you'll understand why he's so tedious, and then we'll recap it in modern language, okay? Here's Heschel. He says it very poetically, and that's why I wanted to give it to you as he presents it, and then we'll talk about it in layman's terms. This is the way people used to talk, I think. It really is beautiful. Listen. He says, in the domain of imagination, the most powerful reality is love between a man and a woman. Man is even in love with an image of that love, but it is the image of a love spiced with temptation rather than a love phrased in service and depth understanding. A love that happens rather than a love that continues. The image of tension rather than peace. The image of a moment rather than of permanence. The image of fire rather than light. But God said, let there be light. What does he mean by all that? Heschel is a deep man here. He says, we think of intercourse again, and sometimes in our modern world, and people especially do, we think of it in this very superficial way. And God is saying marriage is not like that. So when he tells Hosea, I want you to go out and marry a prostitute, he's not saying, I want you to go out and have an encounter. He says, I want you to actually marry this woman. And it was thought that she was not actually a prostitute, but that she tended in that way. She had a tendency to be a little bit loose. So Hosea goes and he marries her and they have 2 children, right? Let's flip over to Hosea and let's read a little bit. The word of the Lord that came to Hosea, the son of Beeri, in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. The Lord says to Hosea in verse 2, go take unto you a wife of whoredoms. That's why it's thought that she's not really a prostitute actively. She's just a wife of whoredoms and children of whoredoms. For the land has committed great whoredom, and he's going to demonstrate how he feels about what Israel is doing to him as they stray from him. So he does. He goes and he takes Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim, who conceived and bore him a son. Now look on down, and she names the daughter. She bore him a son whose name was Jezreel. She bears him a daughter named Lo-ruhamah, which means no mercy. Okay. Then she bears him another son, calls it Lo-ammi. How much time has passed here? Not here. In this story. She weans them. What was the age of weaning at that time? 4 years, maybe. In the Middle East and some nations like that, it's still like 4 years old. So maybe 10 years has passed. So he's been married to this woman for 10 years, right? And then what happens? Chapter 2. Plead with your mother, plead, for she is not my wife, neither am I her husband. Let her therefore put away her whoredoms out of her sight. It's this very intense, I'll leave it to you to read about it, but it's this very intense rejection. There's a split that happens, and he sends her off, and I mean, this is how God feels. This is what this wife has done to Hosea, literally, and this is how God feels the Israelites have done to them. This is what he thinks the Israelites have done. I want you to focus down at the end of chapter 2. And starting at verse 16. Actually, I'm going to start at verse 14. So what's happened is Israel has forgotten God, and they've gone straying out after these other idols and things. And God is trying to express to us through Hosea how that makes him feel. And you can only understand how it makes him feel if you understand marriage. And you understand, I call it the persistence, the heroism of persistence. So you look at a marriage, and this is what Heschel was describing to us. He says, what is marriage? To Hosea, marriage is the image for the relationship of God and Israel. This is one of the boldest conceptions of religious thinking. Hosea takes that principle we read about in Exodus 2, and he expands on it. And he says, let's look at it like a real marriage where the woman is running around on the man, and now he's off, and there's this huge split, and there's this rift, and there's obviously this tension in their relationship. Look at what God does as the husband, or Hosea does as the husband in this image. In verse 14, he says, behold, I will allure her and bring her into the wilderness and speak comfortably unto her. It's hard to think about that in public, right? This is a very intimate setting that he is saying, I am going to take this wife that's run around on me, and I'm going to start dating her all over again, and I'm going to mend this marriage. So I don't know who in the room has been married the longest. We've been married, my wife and I, for 23 years in July, 22 and some change right now. And you have ups and downs in your marriage, right? Hosea is saying we've had some ups and we've had some downs. Big time. What Hosea does in this case as the husband, as the image of God here, just what God is going to do to Israel, just what God wants to do with us, this very intimate sort of relationship. He takes her out into the desert and he speaks to her comfortably. I will give her her vineyards from there in the valley of Achor for a door of hope. She shall sing there. Verse 16, you will call me Ishi. That is, you will call me your love. You will no more call me Baali, which is Lord. You know, there's not any longer this cold sort of relationship between us. This is going to be a marriage relationship. And what Heschel says about that is this is one of the boldest concepts in religious thinking. So the Jews had this idea of God not just as this all-powerful being that we fear, but that we know. The knowledge of God is to be intimately connected with him. It may lack, he says, it may lack the excitement of adventure, but it has the aura of sublimity. It involves restraint, bringing with it duties and responsibilities. He's saying that God's love for us is not like a typical, oh, I love you, and it's not exciting all the time, and marriage is not exciting all the time, and there's a persistence to it that is beautiful. It's actually heroic. You see these couples that make it to 60 years of marriage, and it's impressive. It's like a marathon, right? And we joke about it, and there's lots of jokes about how you have your ups and downs. Evan, Betty, how long have you guys been married? 61 years. And there is a heroism to that, and there is a value to that we cannot possibly value enough, and we know it. I don't have to tell you that. You inherently know that to be married for 62 years is amazing, right? That is heroic. And why is it? It involves restraint, bringing with it duties and responsibilities. But it also endows with a nobility that is a synonym for eternity. Israel is the consort of God, which is one of the most important ideas in the history of Judaism. So, God has taken us out into the desert. He talks to us, and he wants to have this relationship. Going back to his previous quote, it's not the fire, it's not the spark, it's the light, right? God said, let there be light. The light is that sustaining power. He is saying, I am in it for the long haul. You can even run around on me, and I'm still going to find you and bring you out into the desert and speak comfortably unto you. All right, so let's flip over to Hosea chapter 14, and I just we'll end with this, but I want to show you, what I think once you kind of work your way through the book, and you look at all the ups and downs and think of it again in this marriage context, that God and Israel have had, that at the end of it, you were sort of left with, okay, we understand we're supposed to be married to you. We know it's going to be a long haul. We know we're going to have our ups and downs. So what should I do? What do I do? And all I can figure from Hosea chapter 14 is that prayer is our obligation. We ought to be praying. We ought to be communicating with our husband, our God, our Father. We ought to be really connecting with him on a deep and long-term basis. And prayer is our obligation to do that. It is a way to do that. But more so than that, it should be our desire, right? So, right now when I'm out of town and my wife is at home, there should be this connection, this need to talk. For those married people in the room, hopefully you still find that some in your marriage that, if you're out on your own, that at some point you just need to connect. And that should be the relationship that we're looking for with God, that need to connect. So Hosea 14 really draws this out, I think. O Israel, return unto the Lord your God, for you have fallen by your iniquity. Take with you words. Turn to the Lord and say unto him, take away all iniquity and receive us graciously. So will we render the calves of our lips. Ashur shall not save us. We will not ride upon horses. Neither will we say any more to the work of our hands, you are our gods. For in you the fatherless find mercy. I will heal their backsliding. I will love them freely, for my anger is turned away from him. I will be as the dew unto Israel, and he shall grow as the lily and cast forth his roots as Lebanon. His branches shall spread, and his beauty shall be as the olive tree, and his smell as Lebanon. They that dwell under his shadow shall return. They shall revive as the corn and grow as the vine. The scent thereof shall be as the wine of Lebanon. Ephraim shall say, what have I to do any more with idols? I have heard him and observed him. I'm like a green fir tree. From me is your fruit found. Who is wise, and he shall understand these things? Prudent, and he shall know them. And there's that word, yada, right there. For the ways of the Lord are right, and the just shall walk in them, but the transgressors shall fall therein. So I want you to think about persistence, and this extends beyond. I gave you two examples, which is cycling and marriage. But you think about it in your work life. You can think about it just in getting up and making your bed in the morning and putting your shoes on and going outside and doing the things that you need to be doing. That life is a process. And hopefully it's a somewhat long process. And in the process of that time, we ought to be wearing out our flesh. We ought to be getting to know him better. And I think, what he's saying in here is one of the ways to make that connection is to think about our relationship with God in the context of a marriage. Not a wedding, not day one, but I can't multiply 365 by 62 that quickly in my head. But it is being in it for the long haul. It is that heroism of persistence. All right.